Jonah chapter 4. Jonah chapter 4. And we'll begin reading at verse 1. Jonah chapter 4. Jonah chapter 4 verse 1 reads, I'm reading from the New King James Version, and it says, "But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. So he prayed to the Lord and said, Lord, was not this what I said when I was still in my country? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live." Then the Lord said, "Is it right for you to be angry?" This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated, sorry. So we've been in this series here at Freedom titled Jonah Without the Whale. And while I have read the book of Jonah before, I, like most people, generally just stick to talking about the whale. And as I prepared this week, I remembered why, because Jonah 4 is a little weird. Even as you read the book in its entirety, when you get to Jonah 4, it feels like you've been dropped into this argument between God and Jonah that's really hard to make sense of. Jonah's anger and response to God in this chapter seems drastic, and then the chapter and subsequently the book end on a cliffhanger question. So in order to even begin to make sense of what's happening and to glean lessons from the chapter, you really have to be willing to sit with the text and ask some questions of it, which is probably part of the point anyway, in the way that it's written. So in our approach to the text, we have to start with what we know. And we know that in the beginning of the story, God has called Jonah to go to the people in Nineveh to deliver a message to them. And we are told that Jonah flees from the presence of God. But Jonah 1 doesn't give us a reason for his fleeing. However, in Jonah 4, Jonah gives us the reason that he fled. And he basically says, "See, God, this is what I was talking about when I was in my country. I knew that you were gracious and merciful and slow to anger. I knew that you were one who is abundant in forgiveness and relented in doing harm." And he's angry. Jonah is upset, because despite the message he delivered to the people of Nineveh being half-hearted, the people of Nineveh have repented and God has forgiven. And Jonah is upset. God's loving kindness infuriates Jonah to the point where he believes that it's better for him to not even live anymore. And it's a weird sentiment. And it's a weird passage, not only because of who God is, but because of who Jonah is. Jonah is a prophet. Jonah's whole call and being is supposed to center on two things: his connection to God and his connection to people. And we can look back and see this. Moses was a prophet, and his call led him into the wilderness, consistently navigating between interceding for the people and delivering messages to the Israelites on what it meant to be in covenant with God. Ezekiel was a prophet, and God called him to a space of great empathy for people. For 390 days, he laid on his side and did demonstrations as God commanded him in order to physically take on in his body the weight of sin of the Israelites while he delivered God's messages to them. Jeremiah was a prophet. He was in exile with those who had been taken captive, when he let them know that God still had a plan and a future for them. Consistently, we see that to be a prophet means that you live in the space between teaching, rebuke, and intercession. Being a prophet means maintaining a consistent connection to God and to people. So what we see here can be hard to understand, not because Jonah is upset with God, because we've seen that before in Exodus and Lamentations and Psalms. But what's strange is that Jonah's anger with God doesn't align with who he's called to be. What do you do when your calling feels like it's in conflict with your desires? Nineveh is a part of the Assyrian Empire. It's a part of the place that will come to conquer northern Israel, which is Jonah's home, and force people into captivity. For God to destroy Nineveh would feel like the fears of Israel are being conquered. If God destroys Nineveh, Israel no longer has to worry about the possibility of battle with this evil, war-ridden enemy. So when Jonah flees from the presence of God, he is choosing to align himself with the desires of and with a loyalty to his home. What do you do when your calling feels like it's in conflict with your desires? I was recently in Barnes & Noble, and I came across this book written about the mass shooting that took place at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, and about the family and the congregation's journey to forgiveness. And I really struggled looking at this book, and I had a lot of feelings thinking about what the story this book would tell, because historically, forgiveness has been lifted up or used as an obligation of communities who are consistently marginalized and oppressed and victimized. And a lot of times the notion of forgiveness is talked about in this way that positions it in an either-or situation to justice, that either communities advocate for justice or they engage in forgiveness. And it can begin to feel like the experiences of those who suffered are lost in a shuffle to maintain this status quo, to not really make any changes on a systemic level. But forgiveness in the face of intentional violence and victimization within a system determined to not change it's just difficult. Yet to mirror God's heart is to mirror God's loving kindness, and when it's difficult to do that, because what we want or what we believe is just is different from God's vision of justice or mercy, what do? Jonah is displeased with God. He's dissatisfied with who God is because he does not believe that the people of Nineveh are worthy of God's loving kindness or mercy, but also because God's decision to save Nineveh costs Jonah something. It costs some other people that Jonah loves something. So when he flees from God, he's leaving because he knows that if he goes to Nineveh and does what God is asking him to do, he will be a participant in the events that will lead to Nineveh being spared. Jonah's response to God's call is to flee from God's presence. And while I think there are a lot of lessons in Jonah as a whole, and especially in chapter 4, I think one of the major points is about relationship, about what it means to be in and maintain relationship with God even when our call gets difficult. There will be times when we struggle to understand why God is moving in a certain way, and when we are experiencing frustration because the life God has shown us is different from the life that we see unfolding in front of us. And it can be a struggle to be in a space where you feel like your desires and God's desires are on opposing ends. And it doesn't always help that some of us have been conditioned to remain silent and to not question in these times. And there are times when, yes, we have to be still and we have to discern that our anxiety about how or if God will come through is greater than our faith. But I think Jonah's behavior in the first chapter shows us why it can be dangerous to hold on to a theology that requires a faith that doesn't question. Because for some, engaging in discourse with God in this way is a way of fighting to hold on to faith when life doesn't make sense. Questioning can be an essential component of development because it allows us an opportunity to express our feelings and our concerns and have an opportunity to have our faith expanded. Jonah doesn't like the call. But he doesn't push back, he doesn't ask questions, he doesn't express how he feels about this call. Instead, he makes a decision to just flee God's presence. And it seems like a drastic last resort strategy for a prophet. It seems like an act of desperation to believe that it is better to be away from God's presence, from God's voice, away from God's calling, than to let God in on the ways that you're struggling to be faithful to what you have been called to do. When our faith is rocky and we don't understand what God is doing or how God is moving, when we find ourselves growing in frustration and anger, it can be harmful to take on a position of silence, because then we position ourselves, sometimes unintentionally, to start withdrawing, to start shutting down. Questioning, expressing disagreement, expressing difficulty keeps us in the space of communication and proximity to God's presence. There's a tool that I like to use with my clients. I say that now. It's funny because my life has it's very interesting. But there's a tool that I use with my clients who have concerns related to relationships, and it's called the Sound Relationship House. I think Kendall's going to put it up. And it's a concept created by a psychologist couple, John and Julie Gottman. I don't know if you can see the words that well, but it discusses necessary components of a sound relationship as a house. There are two pillars or load-bearing walls of the house, and they are trust and commitment. Nothing else can be sustained or well built within the house if there isn't trust and commitment. Everything else in the relationship being sound depends on trust and commitment being stable. So subsequently, if there are issues with trust and commitment, those issues impact everything else that happens in the house or in the relationship. I had a client previously, and in discussing a relationship experience, we discovered that she struggled with commitment and the other person struggled with trust. So anytime a conflict came up, he didn't know if he could trust her, and she wasn't sure how committed she wanted to be to him. So their house just goes like this. So the other components of the relationship had difficulty being sustained because the walls of the house weren't stable. So when we think about God and Jonah, I would argue that at some point the walls of the house were there and they were stable, because for Jonah to be a prophet, there had to be a level of trust and commitment between him and God. At some point, Jonah trusted God's character and just judgment and was committed to being a vessel that God could use to work through in the world. At some point, God trusted that Jonah had a heart for the people and would mirror God's loving kindness in the world. But at some point, I think that an issue inside the house caused an issue in the walls of the house. At some point, some other issues bubbled up that impacted the trust and commitment. And within the house, within the Sound Relationship House, the Gottmans proposed that there are different floors to the house, and that the floors build on one another. There are a total of 7 floors in the house. Managing conflict doesn't come until the 5th floor. So you got to get all the other stuff together before you can even get to a space of managing conflict. So there are 4 other elements in addition to trust and commitment that those in a relationship have to have. And I believe a key issue that we see between God and Jonah happens on the 3rd floor. The 1st floor talks about building love maps. It's all about knowing and entering the world of the person or the one that you're in a relationship with. The 2nd floor is sharing fondness and admiration, and we start to see some issues here in chapter 4. Because Jonah is expressing having difficulty with appreciating who God is. Jonah knows who God is, so we've got the 1st floor. He knows God's patterns and God's heart, but he's having some trouble on the 2nd floor because his own desires, his own beliefs on how Nineveh should be handled is prohibiting him from experiencing admiration for God's character, for God's loving kindness, for God's mercy. And in chapter 1, we see Jonah's 2nd floor difficulties start to play out in his actions, because the 3rd floor is all about connection. The 3rd floor of the Sound Relationship House is about committing to turning toward instead of turning away. So it takes until chapter 4 for Jonah to even get to the point where he's able to begin to engage with God about the root of the issue, but because before he and God can manage conflict, Jonah has to be willing to connect. And I believe that the message of Jonah's experience here is this: sometimes connection will be messy. There will be times when we are called to be in conflict, that what we are called to do is in conflict with what we desire. And in these moments, it can be difficult to know if we can trust God or if our commitment will be in vain. And that conflict can threaten to destroy our home, to destroy our connection and our relationship with God. But if we can harness the skill of turning toward God, even when it's messy, even when we're angry, even when we feel that the way that we feel isn't how we should be feeling, we actually move closer to being able to manage the conflict and move into a more peaceful space in our relationship with God. Jonah expresses his anger, and God asks him whether it's right for him to be angry. But he doesn't answer the question. As the text continues, Jonah positions himself outside of the city, waiting for its destruction. And God prepares a plant for Jonah to protect him from the heat. And Jonah expresses his gratitude for this mercy. And then God uses this plant as an object lesson to expand Jonah's understanding. God sends a worm to destroy the plant, and Jonah again becomes angry. And God asks Jonah if it's right for him to be angry about this plant, to which now Jonah is ready to respond and engage that he believes that it is right for him to be angry. And then God uses Jonah's anger about this plant to point out how God views the people of Nineveh. And the chapter goes on, and it ends on a cliffhanger with God asking Jonah a question that compares God's passion and compassion for the plant to God's care of Nineveh. But I think related to the message today, that what's important to notice here is the way that God continues to create points of connection. God continues to pursue Jonah, continues to try to teach and love Jonah, even though Jonah is in this space of frustration and connection. God doesn't give up on him. Just like God doesn't give up on Jonah in his frustration and in his pulling away and in his anger, God doesn't give up on us. And as I'm closing, God continues to show up in our doubt, in our frustrations, and in our turning away. God continues to extend opportunities for us to understand the heart and the passions of God, and invites us to be a part of what God is doing in our lives and community and world. And it's my prayer that in our moments of frustration or even our doubt, that we wouldn't turn so far away that we miss the opportunity to see what God is doing. And that those who have turned away, those who have withdrawn and become silent in this relationship with God, would have their eyes and hearts open to see the ways that God is continuing to pull and draw you close. Therefore, in response to the question of what we do when what we desire seems to be opposed to our calling, in response to the question of how to respond when we have anger and frustration, the answer is we continue to draw close to God. We choose to turn toward God instead of turning away. Shekinah Glory Ministries offers us a helpful response in these moments when they sing, "Praise is what I do. When I want to be close to you, I lift my hands in praise." Praise is who I am. I'll praise you while I can. I'll bless you at all times. And then they go on to talk about this vow. I vow to worship you through the good and the bad. I'll worship you whether I'm happy or sad. And I'll praise you in all that I go through, because praise is what I do, because I owe it all to you.
Hey, I just want to say thank you again for joining us this morning in the Freedom Fellowship Virtual Sanctuary. I pray you were blessed by this service and by this message. And I also want to remind you, you can always join us live and in person every Sunday at 2:00 p.m. at 163 Ponce De Leon Avenue, Northeast, right here in Atlanta, Georgia. And as we prepare to go, I want to give you an opportunity to give. Here at Freedom, we believe that whenever we give, it's an opportunity to honor God. It's an opportunity to partner with God, and it's an opportunity to experience the generosity of God's grace. There on the bottom of the screen, you can see multiple ways to give. And we ask and we encourage you to give cheerfully, joyfully, give abundantly. Why? Because that's how God has given to each and every one of us. And when you give, you enable freedom. Continue to fulfill the mission and the vision that God has given uniquely to our church. So I want to thank you in advance for your giving. Again, right there on the screen, there are ways that you can give. And as you're finishing up your giving this morning, I want to leave you with this benediction. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face smile upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift the light of his countenance upon you and grant you his peace. May the Lord bless you when you rise up early and when you settle late, in your labor and in your leisure, in your laughter and even in your tears, until that very day where we should all sit around the feet of Jesus, where there's no sunrise nor sunset. Now go and be